Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you had a quick little break there. I'm still drinking the same Diet Cokes. I did not open a third one. So, my job here today is only to introduce the introducer. Don't you love that when we have introductions for the introducers? Everyone is here in Zoom Room A for today's keynote. And again, I'm going to remind those of you joining us about entering questions in the chat if you're going to ask us later to provide a professional development certificate to you. So without further ado here, I would like to introduce Larry Paska to you. Since 2016, Larry Paska has been the executive director of the National Council for the Social Studies, which I'm assuming that all of you are familiar with. They are hosting 2 conferences this year because we're making up for years. So either this fall in Minnesota or in the later fall in Washington, D.C. Hope to see some of you there. And they also have all sorts of excellent summer programming. And I want to mention that they are a member of the Library of Congress TPS Consortium. And as such, they have a new course that they're putting together on teaching with primary sources. So the NCSS website will have information about that. But more about Larry. Larry was a middle school social studies in New York State, social studies teachers in New York State. And I always want to give a special shout out to middle school teachers. I tell people I went back to graduate school instead of teaching middle school when I came back from my maternity leave. But beyond being in the classroom, he was also very active in professional development and curriculum development, in alignments with standards. So he has had his fingers in about every pie of the social studies world. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who can do the proper introduction for our keynote speaker. So take it away, Larry.
I want to thank you all for the opportunity to come on this afternoon. I hope you're having a wonderful conference. And I want to congratulate you all on completing a most unusual, innovative school year under very challenging circumstances. As you may have seen on the virtual background behind me before I got cut off, we are celebrating a bit of a birthday here at NCSS. This year is our 100th anniversary. We are proud to celebrate a vision in which all students are educated and inspired for lifelong inquiry and informed civic action. We are thrilled to provide a mission in support of you and your work of leadership, service, and support to educators. And I just wanted to talk very briefly about how innovation really has marked the social studies in 2020 and beyond. First of all, just my personal appreciation and how humbled I am by all of you, how educators nationwide pivoted literally in one weekend last March to fully remote and virtual instruction. And you've continued to sustain an innovative practice ever since. And this year at NCSS, we've also pivoted our own programming to support deeper strategies on teaching and professional networking in very different ways. As Liz mentioned at the very beginning, we're a very proud partner with the Library of Congress as a member of the Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium. We are currently working on a really rigorous project to develop online methods texts on how to teach inquiry using the library's vast primary source collections. We're excited to offer actually a summer institute for methods professors next week. And we anticipate releasing the methods texts later next year. Also, just in terms of how we're innovating social studies and hope to innovate along with you, join us at NCSS. We have an on-demand video library. We've been offering weekly webinars. We have multiple summer institutes this year on inquiry. If you are looking for a home for professional networking, especially on how to share best practices, we have a network of over 50 affiliated councils nationwide. We have our own internal special interest communities for technology, everything from technology to environmental education. And if you are looking for advocacy opportunities in the social studies and a way to build your own social studies leadership, we're pleased to announce a Summer Leadership Institute for all members again this year. That'll be July. Again, details on all of these programs are on our website. Many of you also want to bring social studies leadership and growth opportunities to your kids directly. If you're not aware, we are actually the home of a National Social Studies Honor Society called Rho Kappa. It's for juniors and seniors in high school. We also just launched Junior Rho Kappa, which is a program for kids in grades 7 through 9. So I encourage you to learn more about our Rho Kappa programs as well. As Liz mentioned, we are anticipating multiple conferences this year. We held our first successful virtual conference in 2020, and we do have plans to continue both in-person and virtual learning as we move forward. So I won't take up more time other than to say, I hope you learn more about us. Feel free to join us anytime, socialstudies.org. Follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn. We're also on Twitter at NCSS Network. If you're doing great things in social studies, especially, please tag us at NCSS Network so that we can celebrate with you and share what your innovative practice is. We want to celebrate all educators nationwide and what they're doing. So again, thank you again. My apologies for the visual cutting out, but I do want at this time introduce our keynote speaker. Our keynote today is From Provocative to Productive, Teaching Controversial Topics. I'd like to introduce Jessi Hollis McCarthy. She has been with the Freedom Forum since 2016. During her time with the education team, Hollis McCarthy has focused on expanding access to First Amendment education by developing educational content and programs to reach audiences around the world. She has led in-person and virtual trainings on 6 continents. Previous conference presentations include The Challenge of Truth, Fact-Checking Historical Heroes at the National Council for History Education, and Detecting Propaganda, Defeating Emotional Manipulation at the National Council for Social Studies. Prior to joining the education team, Hollis McCarthy developed and taught programming for a variety of museums and historic sites in the DC area. Please join me again in welcoming Jessi Hollis McCarthy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the wonderful introductions. I'm so excited to be joining you today to be leading a discussion on this sometimes challenging aspect of teaching in the classroom and tackling the very critical but difficult topics that come up, from student questions to the news to the things that we critically have to cover. Now, I know I always appreciate having notes in front of me when I join a session. So in the chat, I am including a link to the resources I'll be talking about, with my notes from the presentation that I've developed with my colleagues and a recap of what we'll be going over. So if you want to just sit back and enjoy knowing those notes will be there for you, they are in the chat for access. With that, let me share my screen. During the course of this presentation, the chat is open the whole time. I hope to converse with you and hear from you. And I know when we're teaching in a virtual environment, how challenging it can be to adapt to these webinar formats. And so I want to bring a technique that I have found really effective, both in-person conversations around controversial topics, but also one that I have found is really effective in a virtual environment, because it can be adapted to being a synchronous conversation. It can be asynchronous. It can even work with people responding in the chat. So if you are like me and have spent many times this past year teaching to a screen of empty boxes, I feel you. And this hopefully can give you some inspiration to keep having these robust conversations with your students, and a technique to help tackle them. Now, my title is broad, and there's no way in 45 minutes that I can even cover more than one way to do this. And the one I'm going to show you is just one tool for your toolkit, one way to tackle these topics. It's not applicable to every challenging conversation or source of controversy or difficult conversation we want to have with students. It's just hopefully one more technique you can add to the ones you have used in the past to expand these conversations. And I want to hear from you in the chat. I have a couple tough questions on my screen right here from the beginning. How many of you would have these questions or conversations about the answers to this in your classroom? Let me know in the chat. Yes, no, all right. I see someone saying yes, absolutely. Excellent. Then I have the right audience here with me today, because this is the type of question we're going to be tackling through the course of this presentation. Now, what are we going over? Well, the benefits and barriers to having these types of conversations. And then we're going to plunge in and we're going to be looking at a very specific question and some techniques for tackling that one. I'll break down how we built the case study. We're going to be using a case study today to generate conversation. And at the end, I'll open it up to any questions, thoughts you have for me. Feel free to, as we go through, to put those in the chat as well. I'm monitoring it the whole time. All right. So when we're teaching any difficult topic or any controversial topic, we have to deal with some barriers. It's a challenging thing to go in front of students and do, especially in a virtual environment, but at any time. And I want to hear out. What are the challenges or the barriers you feel when you want to tackle these topics? I'm keeping the chat open. Are there any things that you struggle with or you worry about or they concern you when you're talking about these difficult topics? All right. Yes, I see the not so much the kids, but their parents' attitudes. Yeah, I just have to consider where I live. Culture, kids afraid to speak their mind. Absolutely. Yeah, we have this robust conversation in the classroom and then it goes through telephone and goes home and somehow it comes back differently to us and we have to be worried about that. Where does it go? Bias in the students or bias towards a particular side. Yeah, we think we're going to have a robust conversation and in reality we end up in a heated argument. All right. So differences when we're working across sort of educational structures, I see one from say a museum or a historic site going into school curriculum, and it depends on the issue too. Not all have the same barriers. I feel you, yeah. There's the challenge of like, how will we get reactions to this activity? We said students, but colleagues, faculty, administration, parents. The other thing is we have this difficult conversation and then the next day we have to come back afterwards. So it can't just exist in isolation. We see these students over and over. And also it's tough on teachers. It's tough on educators. We have to put in so much preparation and we're a little bit uncertain about how the conversation will go. And we have to, as someone said in the chat, understand and consider the different personal backgrounds. So we wouldn't be here though if there weren't amazing benefits to having these conversations. So let's give ourselves a moment of celebration for the awesome ones we've had. Has anyone just in the chat thought, yes, I remember there's an amazing moment when we see the light bulb go off and the dialogue opens up and our students start conversing on it. Does anyone want to share an amazing moment? Yeah. All right, I'm seeing some comments coming in. Yeah, so when the telephone conversation got right, when we had that amazing depth, when we saw our students open up, it's these amazing benefits that we have these conversations to tackle, that we want to take our students deeper into these conversations and produce civic-minded individuals who can talk about these topics. So, benefits. It's meeting a need for vital conversations. It's filling a hole to create a space safe for students to practice having these difficult conversations, a space to learn that it's okay to change our minds when presented with new information, to practice in, I will say, kind of a walled garden, how to talk about these very tough topics. And it's engaging, engages our students with the real world connections and issues that they care about, that they hear about in their lives, and then they come into the classroom with questions on. So I've brought a tough question, and I'm going to show you a way that we can have this conversation with students. So my question is, to what extent should individuals have access to government buildings and grounds when they're trying or seeking attention for a cause? And we have to consider, what if opposing groups both plan to protest? Now, this is a big question, and it's a tough one to jump into because we want to come in with, I think this, or I think this and we give our thoughts on this. And that's important to form opinions. But we're going to turn this question around and show it to students in a little bit different of a way. So, everyone, I'm about to change your jobs. So, congratulations, everyone, on your election to state legislature. You are now a state representative for a southern state in their state government. So I hope everyone is excited on winning their recent election and is ready to take on their new job in the state legislature. Now, the beginning of your term is already off to a big conversation. There has been refocused attention on the Confederate flag, which currently flies alongside the state flag on the grounds of your Capitol building. Some see the flag as a symbol of hate, others as a symbol of Southern heritage. The state legislature has agreed to consider whether the Confederate flag should be removed and has called a special session to debate and vote on the issue. In the meantime, both anti and pro-flag protesters have organized demonstrations at the State House. Tensions are running high. You and a group of your fellow representatives want to present recommendations for how these protests should be handled. Now, you've come up with 4 potential plans, and my question for you is, which ones do you recommend to be put into action? What will you do in your new role as a state representative? You'll have to check in with your colleagues, but yeah, we see questions. So, do you allow controlled access within the State House building? Do you allow the protesters to gather outside on State House grounds? Do you designate fenced-in or specialty free speech zones in front of the State House? Do you close the Capitol grounds to all protests until further notice? The topic is volatile, even though neither group has shown any examples of breaching the peace. So, what do you do? And I see thoughts coming in. Is none an option? What would you recommend instead? If none of these work, what would you recommend in your new role? All right. I'm seeing a general thought. Seeing 1 and 2 coming in the chat as sort of the leaders at the moment. What else do we think? All right, convince both parties with balanced portions. Okay. So I'm seeing a fairly strong vote in the chat coming in for option 2. Yes, most people are sending them only to the panelists and not attendees. You can adjust that. So, yeah. All right. So we're seeing this moment of trying to decide what to do. Now, this is one way to tackle this. We can come in, you've taken on a new role, you can jump into the conversation, and this is one that people are asking. This is students are asking. And I see people coming in and editing these ones. Foster some other conversation space. Hold a forum, a town hall. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so we've got to think about our role as a new person in this group. I see in the chat. So coming in and bringing in a new comment, you know, I mentioned you were recently elected. I put that extra constraint on you. Excellent. And I'm seeing these coming in. But generally, we've agreed on 1 or 2. We can continue to have this conversation with students. I can pull in additional questions, you know. Does the content of the protest matter? Should we be content neutral? Yeah, do we need to take into account our re-election? Are we nervous about that? Is that it's on our mind as a new representative? Yeah, that's a complicating factor. Excellent. I'm really loving these questions coming in. Yeah. People want their voices heard, and these options need to include how legislators would respond. Absolutely. So we can expand those when we're talking to students. You notice I have some in bolded font and some in not bolded font. Yeah. Excellent. We need training for police and security staff. Someone's saying they need to consider the safety situation. Someone said, should I be worried or should I go with my heart? Yeah. So we're having to decide. We're asking these questions, but at the end of the day, we have to come to a decision. We don't all need to agree. This is a committee referral. So I'm seeing these questions coming in. Are we still sticking with options 1 and 2 is what we'll present to our fellow state representatives is our suggestion for the situation? Does anyone want to advocate for 3 or 4? I also have noted from the chat a town hall or a forum for discussion. Okay, how do you make a case study like this? It's a little different. We're diving in and we're asking, what would you do in this situation? Stepping outside ourselves, I changed who you are at the moment. Yeah, 1 and 2 are best, but need work. Excellent. So we can do that. Definitely not 4. All right, sometimes we eliminate the ones we don't want to do. We've been doing this for 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, we were able to dive in via chat in a webinar, the complex questions we have about what should protest rights, rules at government buildings in the US look like in 3 minutes. Now, how do we build this? This is from a real historical event. This took place in South Carolina, and ultimately, as the conversation and protest went on, activist Brittany Bree Newsom scales the flagpole to forcibly remove the flag during the events of the protests. We pulled from real history. And when we think about this, you can do that too. Bring in those real situations and ask them to consider what role they would take, what decision they would make in them. How do we build it? Well, we think first and foremost, how are we trying to spur debate? Not someone winning, not a right answer, but how do we spur this debate? How do we exist and ask questions in the gray area of this? But also, we build these case studies to help structure the debate we're going to have. How can we help narrow it down to make sure students have these robust conversations? So here are the 5 points that we use to build these. There's a limited scope. There's a clearly defined role. We're going to generate action. We'll leverage multiple choice to help frame the conversation. And then we have backup questions to help bring students deeper into it. So what did that look like when I break it down in the one we just looked at? Well, limited scope. 1 state house, 1 state capitol. You are 1 rep talking about 1 protest. You are clearly this new role. I took time to introduce you to who you were. I asked what action you would take, and I let you edit. If you didn't like any of my answers, that was absolutely okay. They were reasonable points to get the conversation started. I appreciated the fact that people were already instantly in this conversation going, do I have to pick any of these? And my background work are those preloaded prompts. So why the narrow scope? You aren't taking on all the world's challenges at once. We want to have a very specific conversation. And my goal in this one was to contemplate the First Amendment that protects free expression rights, and specifically the freedom of petition as we've seen it in action through current events, because students are asking about that. They want to understand it, and we want them to think about what it looks like. And I'm seeing in the comments and in the chat, people talking about how we can look at one state, what was happening here, and take that for understandings elsewhere. And I answered the same question, that one I asked, to what extent should individuals have access to government grounds and buildings when seeking attention for a cause? The case study answers that question. We asked the same question, but structured that discussion differently. So keep it narrow, 1 specific scenario. You want to look at a real world situation, and you can also pull the real world decisions. We can look at the situation and see what was discussed and present those discussions to our students in the role of those who had the original discussion. We also want to contemplate and give them that clear role. So I really recommend choosing a very specific role for the students to play for two reasons when we're having these difficult conversations. One, they get to step outside themselves a little bit. And there's a real safety for a student who's never had this conversation before where they can say, well, I wouldn't personally agree with this, but in my role as a state representative, this is what I'd have to do. And I really appreciate there was someone who actually asked in the chat question, do I go with my heart or with my job and the decision there? And that actually can help students have that conversation where they can give that caveat if it helps them sort of jump over that threshold barrier of comfort or discomfort to dive deeper into this. It also gives you a technique for some classroom management. If it gets too heated, saying, is this the way, lawyers in a court would compose themselves, or state representatives having a discussion? It takes a moment where you can turn down the temperature in the room if the conversation gets very heated without pulling students out of the conversation, without that pause moment turning into a rule enforcement or a reprimand. Now, so it's both helping foster the conversation, but also helping you keep the classroom moving and growing. And one thing that I want to look at is that we're specifically talking about action. So these are case studies to generate what will we do in these situations, not what we think, because action takes information. If we want to make the best decision, we're going to have to take in information. We're going to have to consider things and decide what to do. And I appreciate in the comments someone said, I like to front load with information or things like this into it. And that's important because when we build the case study, mine was short for the purposes of this discussion, but we can bring this in at the end of a unit where students have a lot of information and now they have to decide what to do, or after reading, or we can use this in the beginning to get them started. I do want to take a moment to say, keep track of student questions, because one, questions are always space for teachable moments, but these teachable moments could be coming up with a new answer for the case study that wasn't there originally, growing, adjusting our viewpoints on this. The other thing is student questions are a really great place to bring in other skills we want to teach them, like information literacy or media literacy or constructive searching and research techniques. They're invested. They need that information to make this decision. And so you can actually take in, that's a great question. Let's look up the answer. Let's see what happened somewhere else. Let's find that information. Let's share that information with others. Does that change our answers? How does taking in quality information change how we respond to a situation? The other thing is student questions can be a great place to pause. Sometimes, despite our best intentions, these conversations can get very heated and very loud, and we can take a moment and go, hey, we're hearing different ideas. Let's get the information. We need to pause. We have gone as far as we can in this discussion. We need to answer the questions, and we can look into that there. Now, multiple choice is important in this one because we're giving reasonable points of entry. I know the way I learn and engage with new situations. I do this in my head. Well, when I do A or B, and it can help students get this sort of jumping off point. We don't want to tie the final decision to any of the answers, but we can take historic debates or propose solutions to current events to fill out our multiple choice. The other thing about the multiple choice is this is a great place to insert the language that you want to use in the debate. So if you're trying to bring in specific language or specific vocabulary, or you want to point them towards a very specific framework for the conversation, The multiple choice gives you space to do this because the initial conversation is, because of that jumping off point, will come from those multiple choice answers. So you're building in some framework, but you're also building in any vocab or structure at the same time, and you'll see the students start to pull that into their answers. So the multiple choice format, the important thing to remember about it is this: no terrible ideas in the multiple choice format. These should all be reasonable things to do. So we don't want to create one where it's like 3 things are reasonable responses. The last one is world domination. We want to make sure that all of these are places for this discussion. Yeah. So what did that look like in mine? I've color-coded them to help sort of break down where those questions went. So the first one was allow, just allow with space after security checks and things like that. The second one is allow, but outside. The third one is allow in special designated spaces. And the final one is close the Capitol grounds to all protests. So I've moved them through different ones, and you can kind of see that they each progress into the next. And that's what we want to do with the multiple choice. Now, it doesn't have to be as complicated as this. You can build a case study with yes, no. Would you do this or not? Would you propose this or not? And we can also do ones where I have 3 yeses with 3 different restrictions on them and 1 no. So when we look at these, I've also built in a way to scaffold it for students who need different amounts of input before they do this. So you notice the bold one, that's what I read out loud, but I left on the screen these more complex, more detailed answers. And that's to help pull students in who might want a little bit more consideration. They like a little bit more structure, but you know your students best. And finally, preloaded questions. The questions are for me to keep stirring the conversation and to pull students in if they get sidetracked, to pull them back in. It also is a place to layer in more of those goals that you want them to take away from this. So my goal was to think about freedom of petition and protest. And so my questions drive towards that. But one other thing to note about the questions, did you notice that I did not include myself as a state representative? I didn't make myself part of this. So when I ask questions, if students come back with, what would you do? There's a statement of, you're the representative, not me. My question for you is this. So that they don't feel like you have a right answer or that agreeing with you is the right answer. This discussion is for them. And so these questions, that's our goal, to make the discussion for them that we are guiding. Yeah. So I want to open this up to talking about these creating compelling conversations. And the fact is, we need some guidelines and some best practices. And I'm going to share some ones with you that I've found very helpful when diving into these challenging conversations. I do this pretty much every day for the past few years. So this is just my experience. I see in the comments some great ideas coming in. I want to look more closely at someone who mentioned guidelines in there. So definitely add your best practices. A former colleague of mine once called them a recipe for a good day. So if you have any ingredients that add as a recipe for a good day, please share them out. I know we all enjoy hearing the positive and constructive techniques that others have used. But my first one is this: be confident in your content. When you build this case study, build it as one that you feel confident talking about. So also remember, you're not alone. There are many great voices with great resources here today at this conference that you can use, and others out in the educational world who are specialists in these topics. So lean in. If you're looking specifically because you want to have a conversation on petition, look at groups producing information or resource sheets or breaking down these complex legal ideas so that you feel confident in the topic. So don't write a case study that's so massive that you feel overwhelmed. The second thing is to respect your participants. And we can do this a lot of different ways. One, you can set ground rules. I recommend 4 to 5 ground rules for the debate, depending on how long you're planning to go into this. But if you can get your students involved in writing the ground rules for the debate, even better. Have them come into the conversation, set the rules for themselves, with guided questions to make sure we get everything we want covered. And we want to think about what should we do. And not all rules are the same as like maybe not shouting or talking over each other. If you find that your students do this collective we feel or we think when they're really just talking about themselves and people who agree with them, make that a rule. You can only speak for yourself and frame it in the context of their role. You are a representative. You represent this district. If you speak about we, you mean you and the people of your district, right? That can be a ground rule, and it's something that they know going in, and you can keep repeating. You also, when you think about asking questions, we can ask questions to clarify where our student's coming from, or we can ask questions to drive forward the debate. And we can also build in question asking as part of the activity. Give them the case study. Do an activity on bias. So there are activities on checking for personal bias. Then go into their answers. These questions are what you need them to be, whether they're driving forward the debate or bringing in skills that you see your students are struggling and they flare up at this conversation. And the most important thing is when I say encourage debate, I don't mean encourage a student to win. I mean encourage students to talk about it. So whatever you need in this, as you're asking students, what would you do? You want to make sure that you're encouraging them to know that none of these are the right answer, and that no matter how passionately they speak, they might not get someone to agree with them or to stop disagreeing with them. And we don't ever want to set these up as a good idea, bad idea, win or lose situation. And that helps pick the topics we're looking at. Now, I'd like to open this up for a moment, and I want to catch up to all of your questions. So what thoughts do you have? Is there a topic in mind that you're already thinking, you know, I bet this would make a good case study. My students asked about this. And I would like to turn and take a few minutes to answer your questions and catch up with your amazing thoughts. So give me a moment. So how can I adapt this process for daily life? Not teaching. Actually, it works really well in daily life. I once had a case study driven conversation with a cab driver on the way to the airport. So I can say it does work well in real world situations. So how would a teacher help the students to understand that the representative is a representative of the people and not supposed to be there to voice their own biases? Yeah, excellent. So that can be a question to pull in students into that deeper one, is if you hear a student going, well, I think, and so I'm going, this is the only thing I'm going to vote. You can say, well, what campaign promises did you make to your constituents. What is your role? What's the oath? Let's look up the oath for the state you're a representative of. What do you promise to do? Do you promise to uphold the state constitution? You have taken on a role that is bigger than you. And yes, you were elected because of the things you said you would do and bring to this role, but they're not the only things. So pull students in with that questions. And I definitely, when you pick the role for the students, that's part of that be confident, is it might be worth building some questions, because students do frequently ask, well, what's my new job actually about? Yeah. So with these, for younger students, if you're working with elementary school students or younger students, there's still a way to do this. One of my favorite things and ways to build a case study if we're dealing with younger students is to look at something like, would you do this, yes or no? So for example, for a journalism case study, I tell students, especially younger students, you're about to be a journalist and I need your help. Would you publish this picture or not? And then I pulled some pictures from journalism history about the topic we're talking about. There's one that shows like Civil War images. Would you take pictures of where the troops are marching in case people saw where the troops are marching? Or speakers tripping. There's an image of President Ford tripping. And so you can make those case studies for younger students as well to pull that in. And if you're using something like, would you take the photo or would you do this? You can bring in imagery to help that. It also gets a primary source in their hands too. So let's take a look. I'm catching up on your question. So if using this for the first time, what topic would you suggest? So if using this for the first time, it can be helpful to go into a historical topic. So, and there's plenty of Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, decisions on publications, those are just from American history. So we can look at things like that. You could do a court case because, how would you rule in a court case? Those are really well built out and robust. We know the arguments on both sides, and that can be a good one to bring in. And I know, especially for my history teachers here, you've got to cover some of those key court cases. So definitely would be a good starting point for those. Yeah. So I teach civics, and at least one student tries to make the First Amendment a civil rights platform for current social unrest. How can this format help make that issue productive? Excellent. Yeah. So the First Amendment is a vehicle for people in the United States to express their ideas, and it's often tied to civil rights issues. But when you're thinking about that, and students do come in with strong feelings and thoughts about this, and it's important to the conversation, think very specifically about the role that you're going to give the students. If you want to help not silence the student voice or, not let them talk about it, but to help them focus more, because as a representative government, you are bound to uphold the rights of all citizens. And in this conversation, there has to come a decision. There wasn't an option to let one protest go and the other not. So I would say if there's any student challenge, pull those in. So how would you prepare parents for your approach where you're not going to be limiting your teaching to presentation of facts, followed by an objective-only evaluation? Absolutely. So this can be done synchronously or asynchronously. So you can absolutely send the case study home first before tackling it in the classroom. That's the thing about it, is it can be done as a discussion. It can be done as a writing assignment. It can be done in lots of different ways. So you're going to know that relationship with the parents best. You know the environment there. So it's definitely worth thinking about, do I want this to be something I spring on my students and have the conversation, or is this something I should send home with them in advance? Excellent. Now, I'm seeing amazing thoughts. I saw Supreme Court cases, Electoral College. Yeah, these are awesome ones. I hope everyone is diving into the chat and sharing those awesome ideas. But my real question for you is this. If there's something you need to teach and you want to teach it in a different way, feel free to bring these questions in from the past. The question we had today, the debate we had today, I can use the 1894 petition or protest led by Jacob Coxey, where he leads an army, quote, of unemployed workers to the US Capitol to have a protest. My question doesn't change, just my case study does. So if you're already teaching these topics, if you're already diving into something, historic, government, whatever it may be, there's a space to put this case study technique in there. And I'm going to have this up on the screen just for one last moment, because these are the 5 things we built in. How you build them in is totally up to you. And I hope you feel slightly more prepared to have controversial topics in the classroom. With that, I will ask my colleagues here today in support, did I miss any questions? This was such a robust conversation in the chat that I don't want to have lost any voices in there as well. So I'm also going to reshare the note sheet with all these techniques in there. If you are struggling on Newseum Ed, there are pre-built case studies and worksheets to help get you started, but most primarily, you've got access to the notes today. So thank you